Are you ready to perform at your highest potential? Thank you for joining this GP Strategies webinar, where we'll explore best practices and innovative insights to help you and your organization improve performance.
For those of you who joined us the last time, we had a great panelist discussion. I would certainly encourage you to go back and listen to that on demand. We covered unconscious bias and microaggression, and today is really a continuation of that journey. What we want to talk about today is systemic racism and racial inequality at work. A lot of what we'll be chatting about, again, is in that context of a work environment and in keeping with GP Strategies' focus, a sense for what leaders can do to address racism in the work environment. We are going to talk a little bit about the physical and mental impacts of racism, and then also some of the behaviors that are an outgrowth of what racism individuals experience. So how racism can impact behaviors such as code switching, covering, covert rules, and cognitive capacity. And don't worry if those are new terms. Pete and Dwight will share some examples so that you can become familiar and understand what we mean by this. And then last but not least, probably most importantly, we'll talk about allyship and addressing the impact of racism. So I wanted to just start out by sharing a quote from Dr. Ibram Kendi, who wrote a book on how to be an anti-racist, or a thought from him, if you will, because he says that in order to discuss racism, we have to first define it. So before we jump into the panel question, let's just spend a moment to define racism. And you'll see three definitions here on the page. Where we are going to focus today is really on that first definition, on systemic racism. And with that type of racism, really an individual's life is impacted in so many different ways, from education to wealth to housing and health, certainly justice and employment. But the question really becomes for us, and that we'll begin to unpack in this discussion, is how can we become aware and discuss systemic racism at work? We can't continue to ignore it, and you can't assume that there won't be an impact on individuals in a work environment. But it can feel overwhelming, if not uncomfortable, to talk about it. So what do we do about that? We wanted to start there and begin by asking our panelists, and I'll ask Pete, you to start here, and certainly Dwight then for you to share as well. What are your thoughts on how do we move leaders from that place of possible discomfort or ignorance with respect to discussing racism to one of more confidence and knowledge?
Yeah, thank you, Leah. And it's a great question. And I have to tell you, I don't know if I'm going to give an answer that people like to hear, but I genuinely believe, I'll be very curious what Dwight says, but I genuinely believe that the first step is for folks to let go of the need to feel confident in this space. I know as leaders, particularly senior leaders, used to feeling confident, and it's a little unnerving not to. And yet, if we're going to have these conversations, they're not always comfortable. And I think it's okay for us to be uncomfortable. If we wait until we're comfortable, we're not going to have the conversations. And I have to tell you, as an aside, I think some of my best learning has come when I was highly uncomfortable. So I think creating space for folks to talk and being okay with your own discomfort is really critical. And I would say another thing, which is I think when we're too comfortable, we can be cavalier. And if you're a bit uncomfortable, it keeps you a bit on edge. It keeps you sharp and making sure that you're intentional in how you're trying to engage with folks. And then I think the other piece I'd say is just be genuine, be transparent, be yourself, be real. I think that's really key. I think that's key to this whole process is you as leaders being genuine and being transparent about, you don't know. I think it's okay to say to somebody, I'm trying to engage this conversation. I'm a novice here. I want to do my best. I might accidentally step on toes. I'm still trying to figure this out. I'm really open to feedback as I do so. I think that's really critical, just to be genuine in this process.
That's great. Thank you, Dwight. Would love to get your thoughts. And you're on mute, if you wouldn't mind unmuting yourself.
Can you hear me
Dwight,
okay?
There you go. Yep, now we can hear you.
Okay, so I think there are two words in that question that jump out at me. It is the discomfort, but it's also the ignorance that strikes me. First of all, I think this thing about being uncomfortable, it requires you to be intentional with regard to changing and shifting your perspective or your attitude around discomfort and being uncomfortable. I think it's about being comfortable with being uncomfortable, as Pete kind of alluded to. And this is intentional. If there is an intent to move from simply being against racism and deciding that you're going to become anti-racism, you have to learn to accept the fact that you're going to be uncomfortable about it. I think with regard to what you don't know, again, it requires some intentionality around, do I know myself? Am I seeking to improve, to actively obtain knowledge about racial bias, discrimination, understanding the structure of racism? And if you happen to be a leader that's a member of the non-marginalized group, understand that you've benefited from the structure, and you have to acknowledge that. Even if you get that emotional discomfort around coming to terms with that, you can't move from empathy to compassion to truly actually get involved and have the discussion and do something about it until you come face to face with those things.
That's great. Yeah, and I would advocate as well for what Stace has put here in the chat. I think you've both hit upon certainly that getting comfortable with the uncomfortable and being intentionally uncomfortable so that you can stay curious, right, and embrace your own ignorance and be vulnerable there. So that's great guidance and some good thoughts for our leaders to consider as they continue to try to have these conversations. And I think it can be difficult for leaders, particularly as they perhaps move up the ranks in organizations because they feel like perhaps they need to have all of the answers. But I think what you're saying here is, again, be comfortable with the uncomfortable and your own ignorance, stay curious, and be open to creating the space to have what might be sometimes uncomfortable and difficult conversations. I realize, the question we have below that one, what can leaders do to identify and address racism in the workplace starting today? That is such a big question, and certainly one that I don't think, demands a pithy response, right? It's complicated. But I am going to press you just a little bit and say, and ask, in addition to getting comfortable with the uncomfortable and having these conversations, acknowledging your own ignorance, what else might you suggest a leader can do to help address racism in the workplace starting today?
Are you addressing that to me, Leah?
Yeah, Pete, sure. Either one of you who has the enthusiasm to go first is welcome, but Pete, why don't we start with you?
All right, sounds good. I just want to note that I really love the comment in chat about vulnerability, which I think gets at the heart of what Dwight and I were saying. It's so critical in this process for you to be vulnerable and to start with, I think, start with yourself. If you really want to make a difference as a leader, you have to start to think about your own privilege, as Dwight mentioned. Think about where you have unconscious bias. Do your own reading. Attend seminars like this and other ones. Be actively engaged in this process. I'll tell you frankly, I spend a lot of my free time reading about these issues because they didn't come naturally to me. I grew up in a bubble of privilege. And the only way I can break through that is through constantly learning about myself and making space for the discomfort in that learning. I remember a time a few years back when I was having a conversation with an African-American coworker, and I mentioned that I thought that the recent increase in violence towards African-Americans was a result of the Obama presidency. And she said to me, no, there's always been that level of violence towards African-Americans. You just weren't aware because we didn't have cell phones. That was a very uncomfortable conversation for me. I felt embarrassed. But boy, I learned a lot in the conversation that came after that moment. So I think there's real value in that. And then just being, I think when you talk about what you can do as leaders, I would say be transparent about your own journey, but also passionate. I think if you're going to lead in the space, you need to be passionate about it. You need to have done your work, you need to care very deeply, and you need to share that caring very deeply with your staff. Ultimately, nothing changes in any organization until the Caucasians in that organization are part of the process. we are still the majority of people in most workplaces. And we have to get involved, and many won't get involved until they feel safe enough. The reality is people worry. There's a certain portion of people who are never going to be on board, and there's a portion of people who are always on board. There's a large middle group of folks who worry, what if I say the wrong thing? What if I offend somebody? What if I, do X, Y, or Z? They need to see you trying and sometimes falling on your face to give them space to also try and engage in this process.
Thanks, Pete. Dwight, would love to hear your thoughts on what you'd add to Pete's comments.
Yeah, I'm looking at, again, the question is two-part. It's about identifying and to address. So I want to talk about identifying first. I've never seen part of a person show up for work. I think the whole person shows up, meaning everything that they're dealing with in life, whether we want to believe it or not, it comes to work with them. And so I think leaders have to learn to get used to taking a more 360 view of the people that they lead. A very good friend of mine recently said, if racism is in the community, I can assure you it's at work. So if we don't bother to really understand what people are going through in a 360 view, in the community, at home, etc., then you're going to have a hard time identifying racism within the organization. And I think that information can be obtained through listening sessions. I think you can redesign tools that you're used to using, like culture surveys, or even start taking those engagement surveys and start modifying some of those questions to target specifically at uncovering racism that may be present. And then once you start to identify those various issues, I think you have to start addressing it by listening to connect versus listening to understand. I think we do a good job at listening to understand, but listening to connect really is about, the objective is, how can I not just understand what you feel, but feel what you feel? Because there's a higher probability that if I feel what you feel on this issue, then I'm more likely to actually take some action to minimize the impact of racism. And that's what I would add to that particular question.
Great. Those are fantastic add-ons. Thank you for sharing your thoughts there. And there's a lot of activity in the chat, discussion around, certainly educating yourself, certainly endorsements for being actively engaged. Pete, something that you had mentioned. Interesting question that came up in the chat. And again, there are no simple answers, and I know that as I'm even asking these questions, but a lot of chat about what is the point at which you are no longer ignorant? And I'm just wondering if either one of you have a thought, a lot of discussion around ignorance and education, and at what point are you no longer ignorant on this issue?
I think that you are no longer ignorant when you can address the issue, particularly if you're the one that has benefited from the structure. When you can fully face how that came about in all its ugliness, when you can look that in the mirror and go, okay, maybe, as I've heard this comment before, hey, why are you angry with me? I didn't own a slave. That's absolutely true. No, you didn't, but you benefited from the structure and that event, what it created. When you can look that in the face and go, okay, I have benefited from this. However, I can become active to do something about it. That transition from just acknowledging it to getting involved, in my opinion, is I am no longer ignorant to the issue. I'm not saying you know everything about it, but I'm saying that you are now conscious and you're actually involved to do something about it.
Thanks, Dwight. Pete, you want to add to that?
Yes.
You are on mute, so just ask you to come off mute, Pete, as you're sharing.
Correct.
Okay, you're good now. Please repeat what you had started.
Yeah. So I just thinking about what Dwight was saying, and the first thing that occurred to me is a good question about when are we not ignorant. The first thought that comes to me is that I don't know that I will ever be not ignorant. I think life is a process of always learning. One of the terms that gets used a lot these days is the term woke. And I don't feel like I will ever be woke. My only hope is to be waking. to be constantly learning more than I learned yesterday. So I don't know if I would ever say that I will be not ignorant, but I hope tomorrow to be less ignorant than I am today. And so to me, it's anyone who says they are no longer ignorant, I become suspicious. I think we should always be in the process of being open to learning.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I often challenge myself to think of myself as ignorant on a topic as a way to push myself to continue to engage in conversations and reach out and self-educate. I want to acknowledge, too, there's a lot that we're covering in this webinar, and, these topics require a lot of conversation, and we're giving it somewhat of a glancing blow here. So I am going to move us along, but want to thank Pete and Dwight for what you shared even so far. Important topic, and certainly something that we could spend probably the balance of the call talking about just these two questions. But I do want to move us along just a little bit here, and I want to move us forward here. Share just a little bit again of the discussion and take us a bit deeper to discuss the issue of racial trauma. And, as we've been doing in these webinars, we like to first define and give you a little bit of background before we go to the panelists. So I wanted to share the definition of racial trauma according to the American Psychological Association. And racial trauma is a form of race-based stress that refers to Black, Indigenous, and people of color's reaction to essentially dangerous events, real or perceived, of racial discrimination. And it can either come from one major incident or repeated experiences like microaggressions, so sort of like death by 1,000 cuts with the microaggressions. But whether it's a big event or a series of small, it has an impact on people. It breaks down certainly their self-esteem and their self-worth, and can have physical and certainly psychological, physiological impacts. And what we wanted to do was, in sharing this definition, make it a little bit more real, make it a little bit more specific. And, we started with Pete the first time, so Dwight, I'll invite you to go first. Would like you to just share a little bit some additional details on the physical and or mental impacts that racism creates in the workplace. And then once we talk about that, we'll come back around to what leaders can do to mitigate that. But would love for you to start with that first question and share some of your thoughts. And if you could, there you go.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Now we can.
Okay, so I think acknowledging the link between race and poor health is a first step in addressing this. Scientists actually call it the weathering effect. It is the result of cumulative stress. So as I mentioned earlier about a 360 view, the stress is not only at work, in my community, at home, etc. It's a cumulative effect. And what is the impact of that? Well, first, if you look at the psychological side of it, the mental health issues for people of color, the depression, the anxiety, the personality disorders, the data is very clear about the health disparities there between Blacks and whites. And on the physical side, when you start looking at the cardiovascular disease, heart disease, high blood pressure, heart attack, stroke, again, you can clearly see that the impact of racism on one's health. It's very clear. It's very clear that it has a negative impact. And when you look at, I think in the final analysis, when you look at mortality rate, there's no question. As one article from Harvard that I was reading recently, it said, being Black is bad for your health.
And Dwight, thank you for sharing that. Pete, I'm wondering if you want to chime in as well, and then we'll circle back to certainly the challenges are real and the trauma is real. We'll talk a little bit about what you can do to mitigate racism and connect your team's awareness, if you will, with respect to these impacts. But Pete, wondering if you wanted to share, in addition to what Dwight said, more about those impacts, physical, mental, particularly in the workplace.
Yeah, I don't know that I can add anything to what Dwight so beautifully said. Yeah, I'm here. I'm having some problems with my mute button. It's not playing.
No worries.
But I was going to say, I don't know that I can add much to what Dwight really powerfully said about the health causes to African Americans. So I might look at a slightly different impact, which is the impact then to companies of this, which is, when you have racism in a company, not only do you risk losing or disengaging talent, which is clear, but you also lose the diversity and what that brings. There's a ton of research that shows that having an inclusive, diverse environment creates a company that is more agile in a shifting workplace, that can think more creatively and innovatively. That what you want is actually getting different people around the table who have different ways of seeing a problem and giving them all space to show up as themselves. It's funny because when we hire, the sort of unconscious rule many people use when they hire is, I want to hire someone who I could imagine going to a beer with. The problem with that is that often it translates into, I want to hire someone who has the same background as me, which often translates into someone who looks like me, without realizing the consequences to the company of losing that diversity. And so I think people often don't realize that having an inclusive environment is actually as good for the company as it is for the individuals in the company. So maybe instead of asking ourselves, who is going to be a good fit for our team, right? We hear that good fit thing a lot. Maybe we should ask ourselves, is this person too good a fit? Are they too much of a culture fit? Maybe we should look at bringing in new blood and people who are different because there's real opportunities for a company to grow in that. So I guess that's what I would add to the great things Dwight said.
That's great. And thank you for sharing that. It's interesting, as we're talking about this, there's a lot of conversation in the chat. I know somebody mentioned that the World Health Organization has identified racism as a pandemic because of the toll that it has taken on so many, and I think that that's just a telling statement. I think also, Pete, you mentioned something about certainly looking at who's a good fit for the team and whether or not I'd have a beer with this person. I've also read that, certainly what also causes us to hire and bring people on our team that are similar to those already perhaps on the team and avoid that diversity is the comparison of resumes to each other. Instead of looking at the resume and the qualifications of that individual relative to the job, a leader often makes the mistake of comparing a Pete Small resume to a Dwight Bailey resume, and that does not help to increase the type of diversity that we want to encourage on those teams. So thank you for sharing that. Anything that you haven't touched upon, either one of you, in your comments about that second question? You talked about certainly giving space, Pete talking about considering who you're hiring on the team and making sure that there's diversity there. Anything that you haven't mentioned that you'd like to about what leaders can do to certainly mitigate racism and connect with their teams, specifically regarding the impacts?
I think that you have to, number one, as a leader, make sure that self-care is just as important as the numbers. If you are truly interested in the well-being, the total well-being of the people that you lead, I think that plays a huge role in mitigating racism. And I think also addressing some of the workplace rules, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, that could play a role in this whole discussion. I would say, imagine if the job was to drive around a racetrack. Let's say that's the job. The impact of the stress would be, I'm allowed to drive around the track, but I'm only allowed 3 tires. I'm only allowed just a quart of oil. And at the same time, I'm told to compete, to get out there and drive. So of course, if I'm driving my car and I'm not allowed to equip it the way it should be equipped, there's a good chance that my engine's going to blow out. That's what happens when you're under stress all the time, when the playing field isn't level, when you're not allowed to metaphorically have all the gas that everybody else has, you don't have all your tires, you don't have everything you need to be successful, but you're being told, be successful. That's extremely stressful. And so you tend to shut down, you tend to break down, and at some point, you may even check out. So I think a leader who pays attention to self-care will definitely start to have some impact around mitigating racism. And I hope that makes sense for those who are struggling with this thing of what is it like. Remember the race car analogy. I think that might help you.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm wondering if I could just push you a little bit further, Dwight. What would it look like? What would it sound like if a leader were addressing the well-being of somebody on their team? Can you put yourself in the shoes of the leader for a minute and tell me what would that sound like or look like if they're doing it well?
I think, let me say this. Been reading a lot of CEOs' comments on LinkedIn where they published a letter about what the company stands for. While that's great, I like reading those letters and I see the impact of it. Basically, as a person of color, I've read it before. I've heard it before. I say it's about letting things happen more organically. If I'm used to engaging with the people that I lead to only talk about workplace issues, I'm actually going to take time to really understand, not to get into their specifics of their health care as an example, but I want to know that they're feeling good. I want to know that their spouse feels good, their children feel safe, because that also plays a role in it too. It's psychological safety at work, psychological safety at home and in my community. And as I stated earlier, if you have racism in these other areas, you've got it at work. So as a leader, I need to address that whole person instead of just the employee.
That's great. That was very helpful and specific. Thank you for that. Pete, anything you want to add before we move on?
I guess the only thing I will add, I'm actually going to refer back to a comment in chat. There was a little while ago, a woman, Cheryl Bumpus, and I'm not going to get exactly the quote right, but she said something about the importance of needing to believe people who have experienced racism at work. We can sometimes think, because I haven't seen it, it can't possibly exist here. And like Dwight just said, it does. I promise you, it exists in every one of your organizations, no matter how much you want to believe otherwise. I've had this great experience over the last few weeks. I am working with a healthcare company in the Midwest and doing a lot of listening sessions with tons of their staff. And I've done maybe 25 of those so far. And one thing that has stood out really clearly is that the Caucasian staff, all the way from individual contributors up, tend to get on the call and have very high sense of how diverse and how equitable and how inclusive their company is, and then are shocked when the people of color have a very different perception, and then share real experiences that have happened to them over the last week or 2 weeks or month that the Caucasian staff didn't know happened. So just because you don't see it, I assure you, it is there. It is about creating a space safe enough that your staff can be vulnerable enough to tell you the experiences they're having day to day.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of discussion around that today and in the chat around creating that space. And somebody asked about, how you can get individuals who are in the majority race to talk about these issues. And I'll refer to something in the chat. Somebody said you need to disrupt that comfort bubble, right? And I think that is a big theme of what we're hearing: disrupt the comfort bubble, have the uncomfortable conversations, and create the space for people, as you just said, Pete, to surface what the real experience is for them. Great. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit, but certainly connect to what we were just talking about, and wanted to provide some definitions here. But wanted to share with you a little bit some of the behaviors that Black, Indigenous, and people of color often exhibit in order to manage some of the issues and stresses of racism that they deal with on a day-to-day basis. So we'll quickly define these, but I think more important than the definition are the examples that we will give you to help illustrate these points. So code switching is really that process of changing your language depending on who you are talking to in order to do a better job of fitting in. Covering is that act of downplaying parts of your identity to make sure that other people are comfortable with who you are. Covert rules are the ones that you're not going to find in the employee handbook, but they're certainly understood rules within an organization. And then cognitive capacity, really that's about how much of this mental stuff that we can handle. And so what I wanted to do, while the definitions are great, I think it's even more important to illustrate for the folks on the phone what these are, what this looks like, how it shows up, and then as we've been doing with each of these questions, try and circle back to that second issue of how can leaders create an environment where team members don't feel like they need to do those things, and what does this concept of cognitive capacity have to do with performance and employee engagement? But before we get to those later questions, let's start with the first, and really, I think, Pete, you might have indicated you had some thoughts and some examples to share with that first one, so I'd invite you to share that right now.
Sure. So yeah, when I think of like code switching and covering, which to me are sort of intertwined with each other, if you feel like some core aspect of your sense of yourself is a potential liability in this space, you will either code switch or cover. So for instance, if you are gay and you think that the community or the work community is not going to accept that, if you can cover it, you will watch how you walk, how you talk, the pronouns that you use, the things that you put on your desk in order for people to not figure you out. If you cannot cover, then you code switch, which is that you try to be more like the dominant culture. For instance, a good example of that is, and I think Dwight can speak to this probably really well, the way in which often African Americans in a white workplace watch how they speak, how they stand, how close they stand, the volume in their voice, the language that they use. I'll tell you a funny story. I had a friend of mine. She got a work phone call one day sitting around the table, African-American woman. Her teenage son was there. She answered the work phone. And when she got off of it, her son said to her, "Who was that?" And she started to say, "Oh, that was blah, blah, blah." She said, No, I don't mean who was on the phone. I said, "Who was that?" Because that was not my mother. And she had to sort of say, "Oh, yeah, let me explain this person I become when I'm in the workplace." Again, and then covert rules, those are the things, on these same calls I was just talking about, a woman on those calls mentioned what she called the meeting before the meeting or the meeting after the meeting. She became aware that you have a meeting, but there were a certain small elite group of people that were either meeting before or after in order to make the decisions. And that those covert rules govern that, or being on the golf course. You have to get on a golf course in order to get a promotion, regardless of whether you know a thing about golf. Those are examples of covert rules. And cognitive capacity, that's just the exhausting amount of energy that then has to be spent on all of those things. So I guess I'll give one more example and then I'll shut up. But I remember having a conversation a number of years ago where I was talking with somebody and he said something and I went like that with my hand. And then I saw his eyes sort of nod. And so in my head, I was thinking, oh, he's just figured out I'm gay. Is this going to be an issue that he's figured out I'm gay? Should I have been careful what I was doing with my hands? Why am I worried about that? Is that an internal homophobia? And now what I am doing is not paying a single attention to what he's saying anymore because my brain is so full of worrying about all these variables. And so that is the cognitive load that can actually hold down really talented folks. If you've got a person of color sitting in a room who's got a portion of their brain spent trying to figure out how to cover or code switch or what are the covert rules, then that portion of their brain is not showing up being as fully engaged and as brilliant as they could be otherwise. So that would be my example, and I'd love to hear what Dwight has to say on this.
Yeah, Dwight, please share your thoughts.
Locally where I live, I got pulled over. I could see the lights and everything, and I hear the beep beep of the siren, and I pull over. Police officer is heated. When he gets out of the car, he slams his door. And this incident actually happened right in front of the police station. So he's talking to another officer in the parking lot, and I hear him yell at his comrade over. He says, "Hey, he cut me off." And I can hear that. I mean, he's heated. When he approached the car, I can assure you that I went into code switch. If you noticed during this session, I talk with my hands a lot. And Pete, you mentioned about moving your hands. I can assure you that when that police officer approached me, I can assure you that my hands were still, that I was not moving my hands. I find that there's great wisdom in letting my yes be yes and my no be no, because I have to be careful of my vocabulary, my cadence, my style, everything with this officer, because that situation, as simple as he cut me off, can go sideways very quickly. And so you learn that code switching in that instance is about survival. I'm going to shift. I'm going to watch the words that I use. I don't want to sound too ethnic. I want to sound that use my academic vocabulary, and I want to make sure that the cadence is not. How should I put this? There's no aggression in my cadence with my interaction with that police officer. So that and by the way, I just saw where somebody wrote covert rules is stressful. I will tell you, in that situation, code switching is stressful. In that situation, because you want to be very careful, and at the same time you don't want to come off too smart, because now you're getting smart with me. So you have to be very careful to navigate that conversation, that interaction, by applying code switching. And by the way, all code switching isn't harmful. My wife speaks 4 languages, and I hear her code switch all the time. And I ask her about it, and she'll say, "Hey, there are some words in translation. If you say it in English, or if I say it in Spanish or Portuguese, it has a different meaning to it. So in conversation, she'll switch words. But I think it can be harmful when you have a dominant culture that decides that everybody needs to conform to how we're going to speak, the manner in which we speak. And if the subculture decides, well, we want to maintain how we speak, then if the dominant culture decides that, nope, we're going to force this on you, now it's harmful. When I think about covert rules, I think about while you might look at me on the screen and see that I obviously might be follically challenged, I have no hair on my head. That's because I choose to shave my head. But if I wanted to, as years ago, I had dreadlocks. I noticed at work that I was treated differently. There was no rules that said you couldn't have dreadlocks, but yet I noticed that I was treated very differently as the longer those locks got, the more, as my friend told me, I was being dismissed, which caused me to feel invisible. And so those covert rules can be exhausting. They can be painful. And when I think about cognitive capacity, if it's stressful driving around the track, if I'm so worried about the fact that I only have the 3 tires, how can I possibly focus on my work? How could I possibly get the project due in time when the playing field doesn't allow me to bring my best self? So I'll get off it. I'll leave it at that. But as you can tell by the tonality of my voice, that thing is serious business with me. Very serious.
Yeah, and we talked in the previous section about the trauma and the impact, physically and physiologically. Certainly, I think we can hear it, and we're seeing it in the chat: the stress and the exhaustion and the toll that it takes, right, to cover, to abide by the covert rules. It's coming through loud and clear. So for anyone in the previous section who thought, well, gosh, is there really an impact? I think we're hearing it certainly loud and clear in the illustrations that Dwight, both you and Pete are offering. I'll offer one slightly humorous version of, I think it's a combination of covering and covert rules. Even as a working mom, I talk to other working moms, and it's not the same, the expectations, whether or not you have a newborn or you have college-age children. And I had one of my daughter's friends who is an attorney, and she told me that on the back of her desk, she kept a photo of her children as newborns. And these children are now middle school, elementary school, but she kept it there because she felt as though there was a greater acceptance of the work-life balance arrangement that she had, the work-from-home scenario that she had, when everybody thought that she had itty-bitty children than when they started to grow. So I suspect that photo will be there perhaps until these children graduate from college, but it was her way of being able to, certainly cover that now she was, a mom of older children, because she was concerned about how people would view the what she needed as a personal accommodation in order to get her job done. So I think it takes shape and form differently depending on the type of element of your personal being that you're looking to cover or to hide. So what I want to do is transition, as we've been doing with all of these questions. We've talked about creating safe space, and is that enough? Is that what we need to do in answer to this question? How can leaders create environments where covering and covert rules and code switching are not something that people feel they need to lean on as regularly? Beyond what we've already discussed, is there something else, and Dwight, maybe I'll start with you, please, that you would love to advise leaders that they can do to help assist in perhaps the feeling that people have that they need to engage in these behaviors?
I think calling things out, when a leader can call things out to, and again, you don't have to write an op-ed, or you don't have to go on LinkedIn and publish, here's what I'm going to be, and I would say just do it. Just become it. When you hear comments like, well, he's so arrogant, why not squash that and say maybe he's confident? Or she's so aggressive, and change that and say, well, maybe she's confrontational. Maybe she's a straight shooter. And you start sending those little messages to let those that you lead and those around know that, you know what, I know what's going on here because I'm starting to pay attention. And you start to squash those things. Mm-hmm. You stop talking about things and you actually do. We believe what we see. So when we start to see that certain things are no longer acceptable, certain words, or little jokes and so forth, when you start to squash those things as a leader to say, I'm not going to have that, then I think we're very adaptive, and we start to realize that, culture is starting to change around this place. We used to be able to do X, Y, Z, but we can't any longer. So it's the doing piece, and that's the most difficult part, I think, in addressing this, but we have to get to that.
Yeah, which is something you mentioned at the beginning, right? The actions. It is the education and the awareness, but the action. Mm-hmm. So calling out those microaggressions and leading by example by not making comments like that, or squashing them, calling them out, if you will, when you observe them. Pete, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah. Gosh, I'm still really struck by the things that Dwight said in the first question. And thinking about that cognitive load, he actually reminded me of a situation that I think, Dwight, you were there when this occurred. It was one of the last times that we were doing a training, and there were several of us in the hotel, and one of the other African-American trainers came up to me and said, hey, when I booked this hotel room, it was about X amount of dollars. I forget what it was, let's say $70 a day. But when I got here, they told me it was $90 a day. And I'm just wondering, does that ever happen to you? Because I can't tell if that's normal or if it's racism. And what he and I had was a really powerful conversation. That was a light bulb for me. I mean, one of the things that creates such cognitive capacity for people is never knowing how to interpret a particular thing in the environment. Now, is this something that most people have to deal with, or is this specific to the color of my skin or specific to my gender? So when we think about in Dwight's great example of being pulled over by the police, the weight of what people carry, I think one of the things as leaders that we have to do is we have to acknowledge that the work lies on us, that when we have say, employees of color who may come in with suspicion or may be guarded, don't make that about your story. Don't make that about what they're doing to you. understand that there's a whole world of experience they bring into that room, and the obligation lies with us to create space for them to feel like they can begin to step outside of all of that code switching, those covering the things that they have learned to do out of necessity, out of survival. And so I think we, as people in dominant culture, have to have a tremendous amount of compassion for folks who are not in our experience. We have no idea what it's like to walk in their shoes. So this is a big question, Leah. I don't know that there's an easy answer on how to solve it. I do think that there's one piece of it. Dwight said several things that are brilliant, but I think one piece of it is our willingness to be transparent and vulnerable and really open to the experiences of other folks. And again, not make the story about myself when a person of color may come with, legitimate baggage into the room. I would have that baggage too if I had experienced the things I had.
Open, and so thank you for sharing that. Sorry about that mute. I am going to move us along because I'm keeping an eye on the clock, and acknowledged up front that these are big topics and we are giving them glancing blows, but I do appreciate, Dwight and Pete, what you've been sharing. I wanted to move to our last part of the discussion and leave just a little bit of time for Q&A at the end, though I think we've been addressing some of them as we've gone along. We want to talk about what it means to become an ally. And this is where we move right from saying that we aren't racist to actively working to combat racism where it exists every single time we see it. And we set an expectation certainly with our teams and our organizations that, certainly we must address these issues within ourselves and within the workplace, which is what you both have been highlighting in your responses. Martin Luther King once said that life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? What are you doing for others? And I think that that's a really powerful leadership question and something that really aligns with being an ally in addressing racism. And so as we get into the last few minutes here, it's such an important question, wanted to just really, Dwight, ask you to start and say, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to be an ally in addressing racism? In addition to some of what we've already shared in the past 50 minutes, what does it mean to be an ally? And are there ways that leaders can be an ally with the intended outcomes instead of the opposite results that sometimes happen? So I'll just invite you, in the interest of time, Dwight, starting with you, to address allyship and certainly, pick one of the questions or summarize your thoughts as it relates to all three, but wanted to get your thinking about how leaders can be an ally and what that means, why it's important.
I think, for the sake of time, and when I look at all the things that we've talked about, I think this is most critical, because this question deals with the genesis of change. How do we move out of a society that has this structure of racism? And so I would say that an ally is someone from the non-marginalized group who makes the decision to say, you know what, I'm going to use my power, my privilege, my legal authority, and I'm going to advocate for those that are in the marginalized group. That's really saying that they're going to take their benefits, what they have benefited from, they're going to transfer the benefits of their own privilege to those that lack it. And that requires that you take on the struggle as your own. You take on the struggle as your own. You own your own mistakes. And you understand that your education, getting the education around it, is up to you and no one else. Because I've seen where, as a person of color, where someone is looking at me and say, you solve it, you figure it out. The ally doesn't do that. The ally actually amplifies the voices of the oppressed. They're the ones that speak. We can't, as someone wrote, white women didn't give themselves the right to vote. It was white men that voted for white women to get the right to vote. So it's about power, and it's about someone in power saying it will be different, and I am going to stand for what is right. So I think while I'm not addressing all of the other two questions, I think that ally question and what it really means to be an ally, I think it's important in the discussion.
Yeah, that's great, and I think what really hits me is your comment about taking on the struggle as your own, right? So it's moving beyond, empathy and education, but really owning that struggle as your own. So thank you for sharing that. Pete, what would you like to add here?
I guess the piece I would only add is that, to me, if you're going to be an ally, it means being intentional and it's ongoing. You can't be an unintentional ally. You can't say, hey, I'm not prejudiced, so therefore I'm an ally. It is an act of action. It takes, as someone just said in the chat, it takes risk. It takes being willing to put yourself in a dangerous situation. It takes being uncomfortable. And it really needs to be an ongoing process because, I guarantee you, the first time you step up to be an ally, you're not going to do a great job. You're going to stumble. You're going to be awkward. You're not going to say things in the right way. You're only going to get good at this if you're willing to do this over and over. So if you're going to be an ally, it has to be an intentional action. It has to be an ongoing action. I mean, you're committed or you're not, right? And it's sort of get off the fence, right? Because you're either on one side of the fence or you're on the other. And so if you're going to be an ally, you've decided what side of the fence you're going to be on, and you're going to be very intentional and speak very openly and defend folks and do it consistently. Yeah, I think that's what I would add.
How will we know when leaders are successful at making progress in terms of allyship? What will we see? What will we notice is different when we're successful here?
Leah, let me make a point on that because I saw something in the chat that triggered a thought for me. This is not a finite game. If this was a game, it's not finite. There's not going to be the end of the game and who won and who lost. This is an infinite game. Mm-hmm. We're going to always have to play. I think coming to that reality that we're going to always have to play. And even when I stop playing, my job as an ally is to bring somebody else in the game that's committed to playing. And we keep doing it because it's not truly going to just, as we say, it's not going to go away. It's going to be an ongoing conflict that we deal with, and we have to be watchful so that even when we start to mitigate racism, when we start to sort of bring it in check, we have to stay vigilant. We have to stay vigilant. And so I wanted to put that into space before we moved on. And so some great comments coming through the chat, and that just triggered about it's ongoing, it's infinite.
Yeah. And that's so powerful and so important. I'd like that, Pete, if you're okay with it, to be the last word here, because I don't think there is a better way to wrap things up than Dwight with certainly that reminder. I am going to share as we move to what will be just a very brief Q&A, a quote that I believe my colleague had shared at the end of our last webinar, and it really is the spirit within which we're hosting these sessions, and that is a quote that he shared from Henry Ford, where he said, "Coming together is a beginning, keeping together is progress, working together is a success." And so I think with that in mind, we want to continue to work with all of our clients to continue these conversations with all of you, how we can address racism, become allies, and Dwight, to your fantastic point at the end, remind ourselves that this is an ongoing effort. And with that, I wanted to say my humble thanks, Pete, to you and to Dwight for gracing us with your presence and your thoughts on today's call. I've certainly been the beneficiary of your kindness and your generosity, and certainly the group on the call today of your insight and your wisdom. So thank you for that. And with that, Kayla, I'm not sure we have much time left for questions, but wondering if there is something that we can share from the group that Dwight or Pete would like to address. Any questions that you'd like to bring up?
Yes. So quickly, yes, and thank you. Keep those questions coming in because we will be addressing them in a follow-up blog post, so they will be addressed. And thank you, everyone, for this important discussion. I do want to remind everyone, though, quickly, that we will be sending you a link to the recording and a link to a PDF of the slide deck Our presenter or our panelists' contact information is available. Leah, if you can go ahead and flip it to that last slide, I want to make sure that everyone has access to their information as well as our information at GP Strategies. So of the couple of questions coming in, I do want to address this important one. If your leader does not recognize racism, how do you approach this topic with them if you see it happening?
I think I'll take a shot at that. I think it's about having the discussion, but maybe it's done in an indirect way. If I was to ask my leader if next year is better than where we are right now, tell me what would be different. Just to get a sense of where that leader's mind would go if they could visualize the organization being better. If that person is willing to have that dialogue with you, you may find that as an opportunity to maybe add to that discussion to say it would be better if, and better if we also did. So it's more like an and conversation. Getting a person to future forward to see what better looks like is a good way to sort of, in a way, backdoor the conversation instead of just coming in full, where it can be interpreted as being confrontational, coming straight in. You got to kind of backdoor that conversation. That's something that you might try.
Just to quickly add, I was really struck by how different it is to try to have that conversation with your leader if you have privilege versus not having privilege. How much harder it would be for, say, a person of color to try to broach that subject about a bias. The way I typically approach that is by being very vulnerable and open and acknowledging my own biases, acknowledging my own sort of shortcomings, if you will, to make space for that person to hear the feedback. So thank you, folks. I know we're about out of time, but I've really enjoyed being a part of this conversation.
Yes, and again, we'll leave this open for a few minutes after the call today just to keep your questions coming in. Again, we'll be addressing them with our panelists afterwards. But with the time coming to an end, what I want to go ahead and do is say thank you to everyone who attended for your time and attention. This chat was completely valuable. We'll try to find a way to make sure this discussion can continue. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Leah. We do hope that you can join us for our next session, and that one is on creating anti-racist organizations, which is also very important. If you'd like to listen to our former webinar, it is also available on our webinar recordings page at gpstrategies.com. I wish everyone a wonderful and healthy rest of your week. Thank you.
This webinar is brought to you by GP Strategies. Together we can create a world where business excellence makes possibilities achievable. You can access more webinars or download additional resources at gpstrategies.com/resources-library.